Thank you, Ephraim. Thanks to the Basis Center for having me, and thanks to all of you for coming. Dr. Abulafia ended on a pessimistic note. I would like to start on an optimistic note. I think that the situation in the Eastern Mediterranean is average, which means that it's worse than it was yesterday, but it's absolutely better than it's going to be tomorrow. And I think we can take some heart in that fact. And now the question before us is why does the Eastern Mediterranean matter, and what is American policy toward it? And I can sum up everything that I want to say by drawing your attention to a cartoon that was in Haaretz, of all places, yesterday, which showed John Kerry holding up a paper that said cessation of hostilities in Syria, with a big smile on his face and holding up a peace sign like this. And then behind him was, of course, Putin and Assad bombing civilians, and the Saudis and the Turks arming the opposition. And so, you know, just war and chaos, with the Americans saying cessation of hostilities. And that really is the essence of what I'm about to say right now. I want to make a rather provocative thesis today. I think it's provocative because I've been going around I've been in Israel a couple of days having meetings with people, and I've been making this thesis to them, and they have been telling me that I'm wrong. And they've been explaining to me why I'm wrong, and yet I still think I'm right. So the thesis that I'm going to give you, I actually believe. I recognize that there are alternative viewpoints, and that I'm making a prediction about what is going to happen. But I'm going to give it to you rather starkly, because I only have. Ephraim asked me to hold my comments to less than 2 hours, so I'm not going to go into all the details of my thought. I'm going to focus in right on the. I have no sense of humor. Ephraim said he has no sense of humor. He thinks I'm joking. So I'm going to focus in on what I think are the core issues. I think the biggest change in the Eastern Mediterranean. The most significant event, which I think is an extremely significant event in the last few years, is the Russian and Iranian. I'm going to call it an alliance. And the people I've been talking to in the last few days have argued with me about whether it's an alliance. I say it's an alliance. It's part of my argument. The alliance in Syria. I think this changes the whole balance of power in the region, and not just in the Eastern Mediterranean, but in the whole Middle East. And so my simple answer to the question, why should the Eastern Mediterranean matter to the United States today? It's because in Syria today, there is a battle going on, and it is not simply a battle for Syria. It is a battle for regional mastery. And the battle is pitting, it's not really Sunni versus Shiite, although that's not a ridiculous way to talk about it, but it is the battle between the Iranian alliance system and all of its opponents who are not united. It wouldn't have been that long ago when we would have said the Iranian alliance system versus the American alliance system. But that's a difficult question. That's a difficult phrase to use these days, and I'm not trying to be funny here. I mean, it's a difficult phrase to use these days because it's not clear to me that the United States is convinced that it has an alliance system that it is defending against the Iranians. I'll go into more detail about that in a minute, but I just take you back to the Haaretz cartoon. The United States is talking about peace while the people that used to be the enemies of its alliance system are creating facts on the ground that are going to determine everything. So my provocative thesis that I want to leave you with today, and I'll give you the thesis and then I'll argue it, is that by the time President Obama leaves office, the legacy that he is going to leave to the Eastern Mediterranean is a Russian and Iranian-dominated Syria, which means we are going to have IRGC forces on the Israeli on the Israeli-Syrian border. Now, you've probably all heard there are three famous red lines that that the Israelis have about Syria. Syria will not transfer strategic weaponry to Lebanon. Syria will not be a platform for the IRGC on the Israeli border, and it will not be a launching pad for terrorist attacks against Israel. Those have all been kind of summed up. The Israeli government has added a new talking point to those three red lines. In the last month or so, they now say that that we will not tolerate an Iranian-dominated Syria. And that's kind of a summary of the three red lines in a way. And so the provocative thesis that I want to put to you today is in the absence of an American policy designed to strengthen its friends, its former friends, against its former enemies, the Israelis don't have a lot of good options for actually making good on that promise that there will not be an Iranian-dominated Syria. Now, when I put this thesis to people, in the United States or here, the argument, why is this provocative? Because the argument that is made in counter is that there are significant differences between the Russians and the Iranians. There's significant tension that the Iranians were actually quite discombobulated by the Russian entry because the Russians are supplanting the Iranians to a certain extent in Syria, and there's real tension between them. And my argument is, I don't doubt that for a second. It just, if you just look who they are historically, they're not natural allies. They don't have 100% the same interests in Syria in many regards, and there's absolute friction there. However, they do share one overwhelmingly vital interest. And that's, to my mind, why this makes this an alliance and not just a tactical marriage of convenience in Syria. And the vital interest that they share is the preservation of the Assad regime. And that, when we say that, we mean the preservation of the Alawite-dominated system in Syria. That's a vital interest of Iran, an overwhelmingly vital interest of Iran, and it's an overwhelmingly vital interest of the Russians. And if you look at how they're doing business on the ground, the Russians have special forces, but mainly they have their air force, and the ground troops on the ground are Iranian or Iranian-controlled, right? They're not necessarily Iranian troops, but they're Hezbollah and Shiite militias that are armed, trained, and equipped and deployed by the Iranians. So the Iranians own the ground. The Iranians own the ground. The Russians own the air, and the two of them are involved in this operation in order to prop up the Assad regime. So, however much friction there is between them, they're stuck together. They're like Siamese twins who hate each other. But they know if they try to separate, they die. Both of them die. And that is the key. That is not going to go away. That is not going to go away for a long time. That's why I think we can call it an alliance. And that's why efforts to separate them from each other, short of military action, mainly by the United States or by the United States in coordination with others, will not have the effect of creating enough tension between them to have a strategic value. So the fact that we can see in the intelligence, I haven't seen it, other people are telling me they see intelligence that shows friction, that is strategically a strategically insignificant fact. I'm not saying it's not a fact, it's a fact, I'm sure. It's not a strategically significant fact. That's the point. Now, that's the argument I want to make. Let me just talk a little bit more about how we got here. I mean, when I say we, I mean the United States. How is it that the United States got to this point that it sees an Iranian-Russian alliance moving to strengthen the Iranian position, actually, moving in an operation that is strengthening the Iranian position in the Eastern Mediterranean, but also in the wider Middle East, and it doesn't take action. And I think there are two key aspects to President Obama's thinking about this. that lead to this state of affairs, that lead to the Haaretz cartoon that we saw yesterday. One is the president does not. I think this is the sort of in terms of tactics. This is the single most important aspect of the president's thought is that he does not believe in the use of traditional military deterrence, which comes out, I think, of his analysis of what the George W. Bush administration did wrong in Iraq. He sees the use of military deterrence as a slippery slope to war. He wants to avoid another war, and so he draws a kind of red line for himself. Not just not going to war, but he won't even threaten war. So if you look at when he imposes costs on Putin, whether it's in Ukraine, we're not imposing costs on Putin for any of his behavior in Syria, but when he imposes costs on Putin for his behavior in Ukraine, he always stops short of military deterrence or taking or arming opposition, any kind of military action, short of act of war by the United States. And so we are not going to take any action in Syria that is going to impose military costs on the Russians. That's on the tactical level. On the strategic level, the president has a new view, I would say, of the Middle East. And there are lots of sources about this, and perhaps over the course of the conference there'll be more opportunity to talk about this. But I would just sum it up for you simply like this, with this image. Previous presidents looked at the Middle East as a rectangular table. And on one side of the table, you had the allies of the United States, the Saudis, the Emiratis, the Jordanians, the Egyptians, the Israelis, the Turks, and so on. And it's that side of the table is very raucous. There's lots of disagreements on that side of the table. Obviously, the Saudis and the Israelis are not natural allies. The Turks and the Israelis of late don't get along, and so on and so forth. But the United States, in that rectangular table metaphor, the role of the United States in the region was to mitigate the differences between the characters on its side of the table, its allies, but also to elevate them over the guys on the other side of the table. And the guys on the other side of the table were the Soviets and then the Russians and the Iranians, who are also not natural allies. Lots of differences between them, but our job was to elevate our side over the other. The Middle East is a complex place, always has been, always will be. So there's always lots of strange cross currents and contradictions and problems that have to be managed rather than solved, and so on and so forth. And so it was never just a simple us versus them, but that us versus them mentality was the kind of strategic overlay that the Americans put on the region, and that was an outgrowth of the Cold War. And in the Cold War, it was simple. If you go and you read American statements back from the 60s, 70s, and 80s, there was always talk about the moderate Arabs and the extremist Arabs, right? And the moderate Arabs, who were they? They were the Arabs who aligned with us against the Soviet Union. And who were the extremists? The extremists were the ones who aligned with the Soviet Union against us. So that kind of rectangular template, it continued on once we had the Iranians. The Iranian Revolution. Iran was seen on the opposite side, and the job of the United States was to organize the opposition to Iran and to impose costs, not necessarily go to war with or take extreme action, but to impose costs on the Iranians for behavior that we thought was contrary to our interests or contrary to the interests of our allies. That is gone. That is gone with President Obama. In a minute, I'm going to ask the question whether it's gone, period. But it is certainly gone with President Obama. President Obama has a different view in his mind. He has a round table in his head. And the round table has all the major actors of the Middle East around it. And the job of the United States is to convene the discussion. And the United States puts the file in the papers on the table, and there's an Iranian nuclear file, and there's a Syria file, and there's an Israeli-Palestinian file, and so forth. And our job is to put the file on the table and to convene the stakeholders, that's their language, the language of the White House, to convene the stakeholders who have a relevant, who have a position on the issue, an influential position on the issue, and to try to bring them to an agreement that is mutually beneficial. The assumption, there's a whole set of assumptions behind this. I won't go into great detail about most of them, but just to name two. One of them is that we share more in common with the stakeholders on the issues that are vital to us than separates us. So with the Iranians and with the Russians, we share an interest in destroying ISIS, stabilizing Iraq, and so forth. And the other one is that it has been previous American policy, the rectangular table conception that was creating the enemies on the other side of the table. That if we reach out to the Iranians and we reach out to the Russians and we assure them that we actually want to convene this round table, they will come toward us. This is the assumption. Now, what's wrong with this? What's wrong with this is that the Russians and the Iranians are still operating on their own version of the rectangular table. They have a clear vision of us versus them. President Obama says that I'm not in a contest with President Putin. This is not a continuation of the Cold War. And President Putin, he's happy to agree, and so is Lavrov. Lavrov is happy to. Lavrov is happy to have 1,000 meetings in Vienna. Who doesn't want to go to Vienna and have a meeting? It's fantastic, as long as those meetings never have any influence on what's actually going on the ground in Syria. So they will play along with the roundtable concept forever. But in their minds, there is still the rectangular table, and on the opposite side of the rectangular table is us. Is us. They understand us very well. It's a kind of nice reversal of the way things used to be. Well, nice. It's an amusing reversal. You know, you'll remember. Many of you here will remember in the 1970s. It was Henry Kissinger who started the Geneva conference, the Geneva process. We're going to have a big process co-chaired by the U.S. and the Russians in order to solve the Arab-Israeli conflict. It was going to bring everybody together under the Geneva umbrella. Kissinger never had any illusion that we were actually going to work closely with the Russians on this, and that everybody was going to sit around the round table together. But he held up the image, and he brought the Russians in as co-chairs because he knew one of the things that the Russians wanted was just to be stroked and treated as equals with the United States on a symbolic level. It's now reversed. The Russians understand that this is what President Obama wants. He wants this round table. He wants symbolic deference to this round table so they can take care of the real business on the ground, and we're going along with it. Now, the result is that we have handed Syria to the Russians and the Iranians. If we have fed it to them, if they can swallow it. That's the whole question. And that's the only thing that is standing between us right now, the situation we're in right now, and IRGC forces on the ground on the border, permanently ensconced on the Israeli border, is the fact that Syria is very difficult to swallow. Right? Now, that's not an insignificant factor at all, and I don't mean to minimize it. It's an extremely significant factor. The Iranians, Hezbollah, the Russians, the Shiite militias, they're going to have their hands full for years. But I suspect that the operation in Aleppo, which seems to be going quite well with the Russians, I suspect that we're going to hear much more talk about this very soon, because it's not going to be very long before the Russians and the Iranians turn southward and start. In fact, we've already seen some movement in that direction, or so. Reports in the newspaper suggest that we have seen movement in that direction. And when they turn southward, who's going to stop them? Who's going to stop them? Are the Israelis going to actually go to war? I'm highly doubtful. Some of you here will know much better than I will. Is the United States going to take military action? I don't think so. Now, it's possible that the difficulty of swallowing Syria will be so great over the next 9 months that they won't be able to turn southward before President Obama leaves, which raises the question, Is President Obama's roundtable conception of the region an historic fluke? Is it an idiosyncratic concept of one man, or are we looking at a historic change in the United States? And I fear, I'm not certain of this, I won't push, this is not my provocative thesis, I fear that this is not an idiosyncratic fluke. I fear that we are seeing a significant change in American policy that will be with us for a very long time. Now, it will depend on the individual who becomes the next president. I think if Hillary Clinton becomes the next president, I think there are significant differences between her and President Obama on this issue, and particularly on this issue of imposing costs on the Russians. I think she would be much more inclined to impose costs, not to go to war and so on, but to, what does imposing costs mean? It means organizing the region, organizing, having that rectangular vision again, organizing roles and missions among the allies who cannot organize themselves in the absence of the United States. It's very hard for the Turks and the Israelis to get together and have a common purpose in Syria, or the Saudis and the Israelis and so forth. Even if they have shared interests, they need the United States to pull them together and assign roles and missions and present the common vision of the region. Hillary Clinton will be more inclined. Hillary Clinton will be, I only have 1 hour left, so don't worry, I can get in all my points in that time. Hillary Clinton will be more inclined to impose costs, but there's still going to be resistance. You can see it in her party. You can see it in her party. You can see the extent to which she hasn't wanted to highlight this difference. I say this is a difference for her because I see her signaling it in some of her speeches, and because I have had contact with some of her aides and so forth, and I know the kind of currents of opinion in the Clinton camp. Right, but it's not something that she's interested in highlighting at all, which is telling. And the other thing is that the dirty little secret of President Obama's roundtable approach is that it has significant support on the Republican side. Support, or let's see, many of the Republicans who support the concept don't actually recognize or admit that they support they support the concept. But the Tea Party candidates like Ted Cruz, if you listen closely to what Ted Cruz is saying about Syria, he's saying, I am going to work with Assad against ISIS. He hates Iran, of course, and he's going to rip up the Iran deal, but he's going to work with Assad. And of course, there's a contradiction there, because he's going to elevate, Assad is Iran's ally, so he's elevating Iran in the region while he's saying he's going to tear down Iran. His electorate isn't focused on that. The electorate is listening to two messages that he's sending with these contradictory statements. One message is, we're going to have a very strong America again, not the weak America of Obama, but a strong America, highlighted by statements like, with regard to the fight in ISIS, I'm going to make the sand glow, I'm going to carpet bomb them with B-52s and so on. So it's nonsensical as a strategy, but as a message to the electorate that we have a strong America coming back, it's very smart. But he's also saying, I'm going to work with Putin. What is that about? Well, I'm going to work with allies who have the same interests as me, like Putin, so I don't have to put American soldiers at risk. So we're going to have a powerful America, cost-free. That's a very popular political slogan, but it's not good if you're Israel and you want to impose costs on the Iranians and the Russians. So I will just sum up then to say that there are other candidates, I think, that would be inclined to impose costs, but there are forces in American society that don't see the point. They have seen the United States support the toppling of 4 different Arab leaders, and they don't see any benefit to the United States for having done so. They don't want to get involved. They don't want to get involved in another conflict like that. And the politicians even those who are aware that in order to get the result that we all say we want in the Middle East, it requires the application of a significant amount of force, don't want to say that openly for fear that it will harm them. At the ballot box. So I don't think we're necessarily going to get a president the next time who has some of the commitments I would call them ideological commitments to non-use of military deterrence and so forth. And we might have presidents who have more of an inclination to impose costs on the Russians and the Iranians, but not an enormous amount of political will to go do it. So the problem then is that leaves Israel exposed opposite the Revolutionary Guards and the Russians on the other side, with very little possibility, in my view, of splitting the two. And so I have to end on a pessimistic note. I started on an optimistic note, but I have to end on a pessimistic note with my colleague. And I'm sorry about that.